For over a decade, hip-hop fans have argued about one rivalry more than any other: Kendrick Lamar versus Drake. Two superstars, two completely different approaches to dominance. And when the subliminals turned into direct shots, the culture froze. Every lyric got dissected. Every bar felt personal. And suddenly, diss tracks weren't just songs anymore. They were scorecards in a war for legacy. Some of these diss tracks landed like warning shots, clever, subtle, and layered. Others came off messy, emotional, or rushed, leaving fans debating whether they even counted as real diss records. And then there are the tracks that shook the entire industry, forcing silence, damage control, and long pauses from the other side. The truth is, not every diss hit the same, and pretending they did ignores how strategic and uneven this battle really was. What makes this rivalry so intense isn't just insults, it's philosophy. Kendrick disses with precision, symbolism, and moral weight, often attacking character and authenticity. Drake fires back with confidence, numbers, lifestyle flexes, and emotional honesty, framing himself as untouchable through success. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Other times, it exposes cracks. That contrast is why ranking these diss tracks matters, because impact isn't just about aggression, it's about effect. Some tracks barely move the needle, overshadowed by stronger responses or dismissed as subliminal noise. Others instantly became cultural moments, quoted online, debated by podcasters, and analyzed bar by bar for months. A few even changed how fans looked at both artists permanently. This ranking isn't about bias. It's about execution, timing, lyrical damage, and aftermath. So today, we're doing what hip-hop debates were made for, ranking every major Kendrick versus Drake diss track from worst to best. No nostalgia, no fanboy excuses, just cold impact, sharp lyrics, and real consequences. By the end of this list, some opinions might get challenged, and some narratives might completely fall apart. Stay locked in, because once we hit the top of this ranking, there's no denying which diss truly shifted the balance of power. Fire microphone. When ranking diss tracks from any major rivalry, the bottom tier is always the most uncomfortable to talk about. Not because they are offensive, but because they failed to land. In the Kendrick versus Drake saga, the weakest diss moments weren't disasters, they were misfires. Songs that hinted at war but never committed, leaving fans unsure whether they were supposed to react or move on. These tracks mattered historically, but in terms of damage, they barely scratched the surface. At the very bottom are the overly subliminal records that relied so heavily on coded language that even hardcore fans debated whether they counted as disses at all. Lines that could apply to anyone, shots buried under layers of metaphor, and references that required interviews to explain, all of that drained the energy out of what should have been confrontational moments. Diss tracks thrive on clarity. If the audience has to Google for 10 minutes to confirm who the target is, the punch is already lost. Some early Drake-era subliminals fall into this category. They were polished, smooth, and commercially strong, but as disses, they felt cautious. Drake often leaned into vague superiority, success, money, charts, rather than directly confronting Kendrick's core strengths: lyricism, authenticity, and cultural weight. While that approach works in general rap battles, against Kendrick it felt like shadowboxing. The songs played well on playlists, but they didn't shift the conversation or force a response. On the Kendrick side, a few early indirect shots also sit low on the ranking. Kendrick is known for laid writing, but in diss territory, subtlety can backfire. When moral critiques are too abstract, they lose their sting. A diss track isn't the place for ambiguity about who's being judged. Some of Kendrick's early jabs felt more like philosophical statements than attacks. Impressive writing, but low impact in battle terms. Another factor dragging certain tracks to the bottom is timing. A diss released too late, or after momentum has shifted, immediately loses power. There are records in this rivalry that might have hit harder if they dropped at the peak of tension, but instead arrived when fans had already moved on. In hip-hop beef, silence speaks loudly, and delayed responses often feel defensive rather than dominant. Then there are diss attempts that were overshadowed by stronger records released around the same time. When a sharper, more aggressive track drops shortly after, the weaker one becomes an afterthought. In this rivalry, several minor diss moments were instantly buried by more focused, more quotable lines from the other side. History remembers the knockout punches, not the jabs that missed. What truly separates the bottom-tier tracks is lack of consequence. No interviews changed. No apologies followed. No response was forced. These songs didn't spark think pieces or trend across platforms. They existed and then disappeared. In a rivalry as culturally significant as Kendrick versus Drake, that's the ultimate failure. It's important to say this doesn't mean these tracks were bad songs. Many were well-produced, catchy, and technically solid. But diss tracks are judged by a different standard. The question isn't, was this enjoyable? It's, did this hate? And these didn't. They maintained image instead of risking it. They played defense instead of offense. This lowest tier represents the hesitation phase of a rivalry, a time when both artists were still testing boundaries, unsure how far to go without burning bridges or escalating into something irreversible. That caution is understandable, but it's also why these tracks sit at the bottom of the ranking. Because as this list moves forward, everything changes. The shots get clearer, the intent gets sharper, the consequences get real. And once we leave this tier behind, the rivalry stops being a Cold War and turns into something much more dangerous. As we move up the ranking, this next tier is where the rivalry starts to feel real, but still not fully explosive. These diss tracks weren't weak, they just weren't lethal. They signaled intent, drew lines in the sand, and let both sides know the tension was no longer imaginary. However, they stopped short of delivering lasting damage. Think of these records as warning shots, clear enough to be felt, but controlled enough to avoid all-out war. In this tier, the disses are no longer debatable. Fans didn't have to squint or reach for conspiracy threads to identify the target. The bars were sharper, the tone more confrontational, and the confidence noticeably higher. These tracks forced acknowledgement, even if they didn't force surrender. Suddenly, interviews started feeling tense. Lyrics in future songs felt heavier. The Cold War was officially heating up. Drake's entries in this tier leaned heavily into confidence as a weapon. He framed himself as the industry standard, the artist everyone competes with but can't surpass. The shots weren't deeply personal, but they were dismissive, implying that Kendrick's acclaim didn't translate to dominance. Drake's strength here was tone, calm, assured, almost bored. The message was clear: you're talented, but I'm untouchable. It was effective in maintaining image, even if it didn't destabilize Kendrick's position. Kendrick's tracks in this range took a different approach. Rather than attacking Drake's success directly, Kendrick questioned substance. He challenged the idea of longevity, authenticity, and artistic purpose. These weren't insults designed to shock. They were critiques designed to linger. Kendrick positioned himself as the voice of the culture, subtly framing Drake as a guest rather than a pillar. It was smart, but still restrained. What holds these diss tracks back from ranking higher is restraint. Both artists were still holding cards. The punches landed, but neither side followed through with the kind of personal exposure that defines legendary diss records. There were no undeniable quotables that forced the other artist into immediate response mode. Fans debated who won these moments, but the debate itself proves the lack of decisive impact. Another reason these tracks land in the middle is split reception. Hardcore fans appreciated the lyricism, but casual listeners often missed the tension entirely. A great diss track should transcend fandom and spark conversation everywhere. These records sparked discussion in hip-hop circles, but they didn't dominate the broader cultural narrative. Production also played a role. Some of these tracks leaned too heavily into polished, radio-ready beats, softening the aggression. Diss tracks thrive on urgency. When the instrumental feels too clean, the threat feels distant. In contrast, the higher-ranked tracks later on sound sharper, darker, and more confrontational, matching the intent of the lyrics. Still, these diss tracks deserve respect. They represent the moment when mutual respect turned into rivalry. Both artists acknowledged each other as true threats. There was no more pretending the tension didn't exist. Even without nuclear-level bars, these songs shifted the energy and set the stage for what came next. Importantly, this tier marks the end of ambiguity. From this point forward, every move would be interpreted through the lens of conflict. Every feature, every award, every interview answer became part of a narrative. These tracks didn't end the battle, but they made it unavoidable. As the ranking continues upward, the gloves come off. The next tier isn't about signaling intent anymore, it's about inflicting damage. And once we cross that line, the rivalry stops being theoretical and starts rewriting legacies. This is the tier where the rivalry crosses the line from competition into confrontation. The diss tracks ranked here didn't just hint at tension or posture for leverage, they forced reactions. Silence became noticeable. Responses felt necessary. For the first time, fans on both sides stopped asking, "Is this a diss?" and started asking, "How is the other side going to respond?" That shift alone elevates these records far above the earlier tiers. In this range, both Kendrick and Drake sharpened their weapons. The bars were clearer, the names easier to decode, and the intent unmistakable. These tracks weren't released casually. They were calculated drops designed to dominate conversation, disrupt momentum, and apply pressure. And most importantly, they worked. Social media lit up. Podcasts dissected every line. Even people outside hip-hop circles felt the ripple. Drake's strongest moments in this tier came from strategic provocation. Rather than overwhelming with aggression, he used timing and framing. He positioned himself as confident to the point of indifference, subtly daring Kendrick to escalate. Lines in this category often carried layered disrespect, downplaying Kendrick's influence while simultaneously acknowledging him as the only worthy opponent. That contradiction made the disses sting. They felt personal without sounding desperate. Kendrick, meanwhile, escalated through precision. His disses here cut deeper because they attacked identity, not achievements. Instead of debating numbers or popularity, Kendrick challenged credibility, questioning who truly represents the culture versus who profits from it. These tracks made listeners uncomfortable, and that discomfort is exactly what elevated them. Kendrick wasn't trying to win a chart battle. He was trying to reframe the conversation. What separates this tier from the lower ones is consequence. After these tracks dropped, both artists adjusted their behavior. Interviews became careful. Subliminals turned sharper. There was a sense that anything said next could trigger something irreversible. That tension wasn't imagined. It was felt across the industry. Another defining feature of this tier is memorability. These diss tracks produced lines that fans still quote years later. Not because they were flashy, but because they landed cleanly and stuck. A great diss doesn't just insult. It creates a phrase that haunts the opponent. These tracks achieved that. Production choices also evolved. The beats here were more stripped down, more aggressive, more focused on letting the words breathe. There was less emphasis on replay value and more emphasis on message delivery. Every pause, every tone shift, every emphasis felt intentional. These weren't accidental moments. They were crafted. However, despite their impact, these diss tracks stopped short of the very top because they didn't end anything. They escalated, but they didn't resolve. No one tapped out. No clear winner emerged. Instead, they prolonged the standoff and raised the stakes. That's powerful, but not final. Another reason they don't crack the highest tier is restraint around personal exposure. While the disses were sharp, they avoided crossing certain lines. There were hints, implications, and moral judgments, but no outright revelations. The gloves were off, but the knives stayed sheathed. And in hip-hop history, the most legendary diss tracks usually aren't afraid to draw blood. Still, this tier represents the turning point of the Kendrick versus Drake rivalry. After these tracks, neutrality disappeared. Fans picked sides. Media coverage intensified. The idea that these two could coexist without tension became impossible to believe. From here on, the ranking enters dangerous territory. The next level isn't about pressure or positioning. It's about damage control, forced responses, and lasting scars. These are the diss tracks that changed careers, reshaped public perception, and left no room for deniability. This tier is where the rivalry reaches its most volatile and uncomfortable stage. The diss tracks rank here didn't just spark debate, they shifted power. After these records dropped, the conversation was no longer balanced or speculative. One side clearly gained momentum, and the other was forced into reaction mode. These weren't just diss tracks. There were moments that altered how fans, media, and even the artists themselves viewed the battle. What separates this tier from the previous one is fearlessness. The artists stopped worrying about optics and leaned fully into confrontation. The bars here weren't just sharp. They were intentional, confrontational, and impossible to ignore. There was no hiding behind metaphors or plausible deniability anymore. Even without saying names outright, everyone knew exactly who was being addressed and why. Drake's high-ranking diss moments in this tier relied heavily on emotional pressure. Instead of trying to out-rap Kendrick before bar, he attacked from unexpected angles, questioning motives, loyalty, and relevance. These tracks carried a sense of frustration beneath the confidence, which paradoxically made them more effective. They felt human, vulnerable, and that vulnerability turned into a weapon, forcing listeners to reconsider the idea that Drake was unaffected by criticism. Kendrick's entries in this tier were colder, more surgical, and more devastating in a long-term sense. He didn't sound angry, he sounded certain. His delivery felt like a verdict rather than an argument. Instead of trading insults, Kendrick framed himself as an observer exposing truths the audience already suspected but hadn't articulated. That approach didn't just challenge Drake. It challenged the audience to question what they valued in hip-hop. These diss tracks also benefited from perfect timing. They dropped when anticipation was already boiling, which amplified their impact instantly. Within hours, timelines were flooded, reaction videos exploded, and think pieces started circulating. Silence from the other side didn't feel strategic anymore, it felt loud. Every day without a response added weight to the diss. Another defining feature of this tier is replay value with purpose. These tracks weren't just listened to once for shock. Fans kept returning to them to unpack layers, catch hidden meanings, and debate intent. That depth gave them longevity, turning them into reference points whenever the rivalry resurfaced. Production choices here were ruthless. Minimalist beats, dark tones, little room to hide behind melody. The instrumentals existed to serve the lyrics, not distract from them. That choice made every word feel heavier. Every pause felt deliberate. Every line felt like it was meant to be remembered. What truly elevates this tier is aftermath. These diss tracks forced changes. Narratives shifted. Public perception tilted. Certain talking points never recovered. Even when the opponent responded, it felt reactive rather than dominant. In hip-hop battles, controlling the narrative is everything, and these tracks seized it. Yet, despite their power, these diss tracks still fall just short of the absolute top because they didn't completely end the conversation. They wounded, embarrassed, and destabilized, but they didn't deliver the final blow. The rivalry survived, even if it limped. This tier represents the moment where the battle stopped being fun and started being serious, where careers, legacies, and personal pride were clearly on the line. The air felt heavier, the stakes felt higher, and the margin for error disappeared. And then there's the final tier, the diss tracks that didn't just dominate a moment, but define the entire rivalry. The ones that people will reference decades from now when talking about hip-hop's greatest battles. Once we reach that level, there's no debate left, only impact, damage, and history written in bars. At the very top of this ranking sit the diss tracks that didn't just win rounds, they defined the war. These are the records that ended debates, forced uncomfortable silence, and permanently altered how the Kendrick-Lamar versus Drake rivalry is remembered. Everything below this tier led up to these moments. Once these tracks dropped, there was no resetting the narrative, no neutral ground left to stand on. History chose sides. What makes a top-tier diss track isn't just aggression or lyricism, it's finality. These songs feel like conclusions even when the artists technically keep moving forward. They carry a sense of inevitability, as if the outcome was decided the moment the beat started. Listeners don't ask who won. They argue about how badly the other side was hurt. Kendrick's highest-ranked diss moments belong here because of conceptual dominance. He didn't just insult Drake, he dismantled the framework Drake operated within. Instead of attacking charts, money, or fame, Kendrick attacked meaning. He framed success as hollow without authenticity, popularity as irrelevant without purpose. That approach didn't just land bars, it planted doubts that lingered long after the song ended. What made these tracks devastating was Kendrick's restraint. He never sounded rushed, emotional, or defensive. His delivery was calm, almost detached, which made the critiques feel indisputable. It wasn't a fight, it was a diagnosis. And in hip-hop, nothing hits harder than sounding like you've already won before the other person even speaks. Drake's presence in this top tier comes from moments where he forced immediate reaction. On his best diss records, Drake used timing, accessibility, and emotional clarity to dominate conversation instantly. These tracks weren't just heard, they were unavoidable. Clubs played them. Social media repeated them. Even critics who disagreed with the message had to acknowledge the execution. The difference between these tracks and every tier below is cultural penetration. These songs escaped the confines of rap debates and entered mainstream consciousness. People who didn't follow the rivalry knew something major had happened. That level of reach is rare, and it's what separates good diss tracks from legendary ones. Another defining element is quotability. The best diss tracks create lines that become shorthand for the entire beef. Say one bar, and everyone knows exactly what moment you're referencing. These tracks produce those lines, not through gimmicks, but through precision. The production choices here were flawless. Every beat matched the emotional intent of the lyrics. Nothing felt accidental. Nothing felt safe. These tracks sounded like they were made knowing they would be remembered, and that confidence translated into impact. Perhaps most importantly, these diss tracks reshaped legacy conversations. After they dropped, discussions about Kendrick and Drake changed permanently. The rivalry stopped being hypothetical and became historical. Future releases from both artists were judged against these moments, whether they wanted that or not. These songs also closed doors. They made certain collaborations impossible. They hardened positions. And while neither artist disappeared, the relationship between them was irreversibly altered. That's the true mark of a top-tier diss. It leaves scars. In the end, ranking Kendrick versus Drake diss tracks isn't just about bars, it's about impact over time. And the tracks at the top didn't just survive time, they shaped it. They turned rivalry into legacy, tension into history, and music into a case study in how power, ego, and artistry collide. This is where the list ends, because beyond this point, there's nothing higher to climb. Only echoes of the moment hip-hop stood still and listened. If you made it all the way to the end, you already know this rivalry isn't just about music, it's about legacy, ego, and how power really works in hip-hop. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you agree with this ranking? Or did we get it completely wrong? Which diss track do you think truly shifted the balance between Kendrick and Drake? Drop your list in the comments and let's debate it properly. If you enjoy deep breakdowns that go beyond surface-level reactions, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. More raw hip-hop stories, rivalries, and untold details are coming. And trust us, the next one is going to spark even bigger conversations.